The whole county had an opinion about Virginia Dalton, and not a single soul kept it to themselves. She had heard it whispered at the dry goods store, muttered behind gloved hands at Sunday service, and announced plainly by men who thought directness was the same thing as wisdom. Virginia Dalton was too proud, too certain of herself, too unwilling to bow her head the way a woman in Calhoun County, Texas, was supposed to bow her head in the year 1882. She ran her father's ranch alone after he died, refused 3 marriage proposals in 2 years, and had once told the county sheriff to his face that his interpretation of property law was wrong, and then proved it by pulling a leather-bound copy of the Texas statutes from her saddlebag and reading the relevant passage aloud in the middle of Main Street in the town of Harlow, while half the population watched with their mouths open. That was Virginia Dalton. She was 26 years old, stood 5 feet and 7 inches tall, had dark chestnut hair that she mostly kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and possessed a pair of brown eyes that people said could either warm you like firelight or cut you like a Kansas wind, depending on what you had done or said. She wore practical clothing, split riding skirts and sturdy boots and cotton blouses that were clean and pressed but bore no frivolous ornamentation. Because she had a ranch to run, and ornamentation had never once helped her mend a fence line or negotiate a fair price at the cattle auction in Victorville. The Dalton spread sat on 420 acres of rolling Texas grassland, and it had been her father Edmund Dalton's life work. Edmund had come out of Tennessee with nothing but a mule, a used saddle, and the kind of stubborn faith in the future that men either carried to their graves as a gift or as a wound. In his case, it had been both. He built the ranch into something real, raised cattle and a little wheat, and raised Virginia to understand that this land was worth more than any man's approval. He died of a fever in the autumn of 1880, leaving the ranch to Virginia in his will, and leaving the county with something to talk about for the better part of 2 years. The problem, if you asked the county, was not that Virginia had inherited. It was that she managed the place so competently that it made everyone uncomfortable. She hired good hands, negotiated fair wages, kept detailed ledgers, repaired what needed repairing, and sold her cattle at prices that made the men at the auction house blink. She did all of this without a husband standing beside her, and that particular absence seemed to bother the county of Calhoun far more than it bothered Virginia herself. She had tried once to explain her position to Mrs. Clara Beecham, the banker's wife, who had taken it upon herself to counsel Virginia on the matter of marriage during a quilting circle that Virginia attended out of a sense of neighborly obligation rather than genuine enthusiasm. Mrs. Beecham had said, with great kindness in her voice and not a great deal of sense in her words, that a woman running a ranch alone was like a ship without a rudder, and that Virginia ought to think about her future and her happiness and the natural order of things. Virginia had set down her quilting, looked at Mrs. Beecham with perfect calm, and said that a ship without a rudder was one thing, but a ship with a rudder pointed in the wrong direction was considerably worse, and she intended to be very careful about the direction she chose. Then she had picked up her quilting again as if the matter were fully settled. Mrs. Beecham had not invited her back to the quilting circle. The spring of 1882 arrived with rain that came at exactly the right time and then stopped at exactly the right time, and Virginia found herself cautiously hopeful about the year ahead. Her herd had wintered well. The fence lines on the north and west pastures were solid. She had hired on 2 new hands to replace the ones who had moved on, a steady older man named Hector Baines, who had 20 years of ranch experience and asked no unnecessary questions, and a young fellow named Tobias who was green but eager, and whose principal qualification was that he showed up exactly when he said he would, which Virginia considered underrated. She was in the middle of inventory at the barn on a Tuesday morning in April when she heard hoofbeats on the road that ran along the front edge of her property, and then the sound of a gate being lifted and hoofbeats changing direction, coming toward the ranch house. She set down her ledger and walked out. The man who rode into her yard was on a dark bay horse that was travel-dusty but well cared for. The man himself was tall in the saddle. She could tell that even before he dismounted, with the lean, work-built look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors doing difficult things. He wore a plain brown hat, a canvas work coat, and boots that had seen considerable country. He was, she guessed, close to her own age, perhaps a year or two older. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, a jaw that needed a razor, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like the color of sage after rain. He dismounted with the natural ease of a man who had climbed off a horse 10,000 times, looped his reins over the hitching post, and turned to face her. He took off his hat. That surprised her. Men approaching her property with something to ask usually led with the ask and remembered the hat removal later, if at all. "Miss Dalton," he said. "I am," she said, and waited. "My name is Ira Morgan. I've been riding up from the Noose's country for the past 4 days, and I heard in Harlow that you might be looking to hire on a hand who knows cattle and knows fence work, and knows how to keep his mouth shut when keeping his mouth shut is the appropriate response." She studied him for a moment. He held her gaze without aggression and without the particular brand of discomfort that men sometimes showed when they were looking at a woman who was going to decide whether to hire them rather than the other way around. "Who told you I was hiring?" she asked. "Fellow at the livery, named Purcell." That was old Gene Purcell, who had been her father's friend and who kept his ear reliably close to the ground. She trusted Gene's judgment, which was the only reason she did not simply send this Ira Morgan back down her road. "What were you doing in the Noose's country?" she asked. "Working for a man named Castillo." He ran about 300 head on land that had been in his family since before Texas was Texas. His sons took over the operation in the fall, and they wanted to bring in family to fill the hired positions, which is reasonable enough. She noticed that he said this without bitterness. That was another mark in his favor. "Can you shoe a horse?" she asked. "Yes." "Can you stretch wire without 3 other men to help you?" "Yes." "Have you ever had trouble with drinking or gambling?" "I enjoy a game of cards on occasion. I don't bet more than I'm willing to lose, and I don't drink anything stronger than beer when I'm working a job." "That's a more honest answer than most men give," she said. "The usual answer is no to both." "The usual answer is what people think you want to hear," he said. "I find that telling people what they want to hear tends to create problems down the line." She looked at him for another moment. Behind her, she could hear Hector moving around inside the barn and the soft sound of the cattle in the near pasture. The sky above was pale blue and enormous, the way Texas skies had a habit of being in April, and the mesquite at the edge of the yard was just beginning to show its feathery new growth. "I pay $12 a month and board," she said. "The bunkhouse has 4 bunks and 2 of them are occupied. Meals are your own responsibility except Sunday dinner, which I provide because I believe it builds reasonable goodwill and my father started the tradition. You work sunrise to the job being done, which some days is sundown and some days is later. I run a fair operation and I expect fair work. If you have complaints, you bring them to me directly. If you go around me, I'll know, and that will be the end of your employment. Is that acceptable?" "More than acceptable," Ira Morgan said. "All right then," she said. "Put your horse in the 3rd stall and introduce yourself to Hector. Tobias is out at the east fence line. You can ride out to meet him after you've settled in." He nodded, put his hat back on, and led his horse toward the barn. Virginia watched him go and then went back to her inventory, telling herself firmly that she had noticed nothing in particular about Ira Morgan except that he seemed competent and answered questions directly. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. The first weeks of Ira Morgan's employment on the Dalton ranch passed without incident, which was itself something Virginia kept track of. Men who created no incidents in their first weeks were rarer than they should have been. Ira did what he was asked, did it well, found work to do in the spaces between instructions, and treated Hector and Tobias with the straightforward respect of a man who understood that a good working outfit depended on its members functioning as a unit rather than as competing individual interests. He was also, Virginia noticed despite her best efforts not to notice things of this kind, good with horses in a way that went beyond competence into something closer to intuition. She had a bay mare named Clover that had developed a mistrust of strangers after a bad experience with a previous hand who had been rough with a bridle. And Clover had a habit of throwing her head and rolling her eyes, and generally making herself difficult when someone new tried to approach her. Within 3 days of his arrival, Ira had made his peace with Clover using nothing more than patience and a steady voice, and the kind of body language that communicated, even to a horse, that there was nothing here to be afraid of. Virginia saw this from the kitchen window one evening and stood there longer than was necessary watching it. It was in the 3rd week that the first real trouble arrived, and it came in the form of Jeremiah Colt. Jeremiah Colt was the largest landowner in the southern half of Calhoun County. He ran over 2,000 head across 6,000 acres, employed 30 men, and operated on the fundamental belief, which he had never quite articulated plainly but which governed every action he took, that the world was divided into large and small, and that large was always right to consume small whenever the opportunity presented itself. He had tried, after Edmund Dalton's death, to purchase the Dalton spread at a price that was roughly half its value. Virginia had declined. He had sent his lawyer to explain that the price was actually quite generous given Virginia's situation. Virginia had sent the lawyer back with a counteroffer that was $4,000 above market rate, which was not a genuine offer but a statement. Colt had understood the statement. It had not made him happy. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon with 2 of his men behind him, riding up to the Dalton yard the way men like Jeremiah Colt rode everywhere, as if the ground they were crossing already belonged to them. Virginia came out of the house when she heard them. She was carrying a cup of coffee because she had been reviewing the ranch accounts inside and had not yet set the cup down, and she faced Jeremiah Colt across the yard with her coffee in one hand and the expression of a woman whose time is moderately valuable. "Jeremiah," she said. "Virginia," he said from horseback. He did not dismount. "Heard you brought on some new hands." "That is generally the sort of thing that happens on a working ranch," she said. One of his men, the one on the left, who had a wide flat face and a way of looking around that suggested he was cataloging the property, smirked. Colt did not. "I heard you also had a conversation with Carl Weston over at the land office about the water rights on the creek section." "I had a conversation with Carl about what my father's deed actually says about the creek section, which is different from what your surveyor claimed it said last fall." "Those surveys are expensive," Colt said. "Lot of trouble for a small spread." "The trouble is worth it when the outcome is knowing where my water rights begin and end," Virginia said. "I'd offer you coffee, but I expect you're not staying." Colt looked at her for a long moment with the particular look of a man who was accustomed to people being more intimidated than she was. Then he looked past her toward the barn, where Ira had emerged at some point during the conversation and was standing in the shade of the doorway with no obvious urgency but with a very obvious attentiveness. "New man," Colt said. "That's my business," Virginia said. Colt pulled his horse around. His men followed. He did not say goodbye, which was fine because Virginia did not need it. When the sound of their horses had faded down the road, Virginia turned and found Ira had walked a few steps out of the barn doorway. He was not looking after Colt's party. He was looking at her. "Trouble?" he asked. "Jeremiah Colt has been trouble since before you arrived," she said. "Nothing has changed." "What does he want?" "This land," she said. "The water rights on the South Creek are worth more than the land itself in a dry year, and he knows it." Ira nodded slowly. "What are you planning to do about it?" She looked at him with a slight lift of one eyebrow. "I am planning to continue owning my land and my water rights, which is not a plan so much as a statement of intent. The legal end of it is moving forward. Carl Weston is a decent man and he reads a deed honestly. And if Colt decides legal channels aren't fast enough for him, she held Ira's gaze for a moment. Then I will deal with that when it happens, she said. The way I deal with everything, one problem at a time. He nodded again, and she went back inside. But that night, sitting at her father's desk with the lamp burning low and the April wind moving through the window screen, she found herself thinking not about Jeremiah Colt and his ambitions, but about the way Ira Morgan had looked at her in the yard, not with the sideways concern of someone who thought she needed rescuing, and not with the careful neutrality of an employee maintaining professional distance, but with something that she could only describe as genuine regard. As if he looked at her and saw not a problem to be solved or a situation to be managed, but simply a person he found interesting and worth paying attention to. She told herself it did not matter. She had a ranch to run. The matter with Colt escalated, as she had expected it might, in the second week of May. She woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of cattle moving in an unusual way, not the random shifting of animals in the dark, but a focused, driven movement that meant someone was pushing them. She was dressed and out the door before she had fully thought through the decision, and she was on her horse within 3 minutes, riding toward the south pasture in the blue-black dark. Hector was already there, having heard the same thing from the bunkhouse. What they found was not rustlers in the traditional sense, but 3 of Colt's men, including the wide-faced one from the yard visit, running the south herd toward the section of fence that bordered Colt's property. Not stealing them outright. That would have been too clean and too obvious. Just running them through into Colt's pasture and disappearing into the dark, leaving Colt with the ability to claim, in the morning, that the fence had been down and the cattle had wandered. Virginia cut around the herd before they reached the fence, turned them back with more skill than the 3 men apparently expected from a woman on horseback at 4 in the morning, and then held her ground in the darkness while Colt's men chose between confronting her and retreating. They retreated. In the morning she rode to the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Briggs who was not her favorite person but was not corrupt, and told him exactly what she had witnessed. Briggs wrote it down and looked at her with the expression of a man weighing the political cost of different courses of action. She told him that she had 2 witnesses, Hector Baines and Tobias, who had arrived at the tail end of the incident, and that if he declined to investigate, she would be writing a letter to the district judge in Cairo, whose name was Richard Harwell and who had been a friend of her father's. Briggs investigated. What was notable to Virginia, reflecting on it later, was not that she had handled the situation. She had expected to handle it. What was notable was that, when she returned from the sheriff's office and told Ira what had happened, his first response was not to say that he could have handled it for her, or that she should have waited, or any of the dozen variations on that theme that men tended to offer when confronted with evidence that a woman had managed something difficult without their input. His first response was to say, "What do you need now?" She had found herself slightly thrown by the question in a way she did not entirely understand. "To make sure the south fence line is checked and reinforced," she said. "I'll start on it after lunch," he said. "Tobias can help." And that was the end of it. The days grew longer and warmer as May deepened into June, and the Dalton ranch settled into the particular rhythm of a good working season. The cattle were gaining well. The fence work that had been needed got done. The water rights dispute ground forward through legal channels at the pace of all legal things, which was slow, but Virginia was informed by the land office, moving in her favor. And Ira Morgan continued to be a presence on the ranch that Virginia found herself increasingly unwilling to categorize as simply one of her hands. It happened gradually, the way most real things happen, not in a single moment of dramatic revelation, but in the accumulation of small things. The way he listened when she talked, not with the polite half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with a quality of listening that made her feel her words were actually landing somewhere. The way he would sometimes bring a cup of coffee to the barn when she was doing evening inventory, without being asked, and without making it a notable gesture, just setting it near where she was working, and then going back to whatever he had been doing, as if coffee near work was a basic principle he believed in. The way he spoke about the land, not as something to be used or exploited, but as something to be understood, with the same respect she felt for it herself. One evening in late June, with the light going golden and the heat beginning to lift at last, she found him sitting on the fence at the edge of the east pasture, watching the cattle in the way that experienced ranch hands sometimes did. Not doing anything in particular, just watching, the way a doctor reads a patient's face for things they are not saying. She climbed up and sat on the fence beside him, which was not a usual thing for her to do with any of her employees, and she was aware of this but sat down anyway. "They're looking good," she said. "They are," he agreed. "That third calf in the far corner has been moving a little odd. I was going to have a look at her feet in the morning." "I noticed that too," she said, which surprised him slightly. She could tell by the brief shift of his expression. "You didn't think I watched them this closely." "I should have known better," he said, and he smiled, which was not something she had seen him do fully until that moment, and it was the kind of smile that did something inconvenient to the air in her chest. They sat in silence for a while, which was a comfortable silence, the kind that two people can only have when they have been in each other's company long enough to stop feeling obligated to fill it. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "You can ask," she said. "What do you actually want for this place, long term?" She looked at the cattle in the low golden light, at her fence lines and her grass and the distant mesquite, and the sky going from blue to amber at the edges. "I want it to last," she said. "I want it to be here in 50 years the way it's here now, running honestly and well. My father built it from nothing, and it would be a poor tribute to let it dissolve because the county thinks a woman can't hold on to 400 acres. You don't strike me as someone who's going to let the county's opinion guide your decisions," he said. "I don't," she said, "but it would be dishonest to pretend it doesn't have a weight to it. When enough people say a thing about you, you start, not believing it exactly but carrying the awareness of it, like a stone in your boot. You keep walking but you know it's there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother ran a ferry crossing for 11 years in the hill country after my father broke his back in a fall. 3 boys under 12 and a ferry crossing, and everyone told her she ought to sell out and move in with her sister in San Antonio. She never sold. She ran that ferry until my oldest brother was old enough to take it over, and then she sat down in her porch chair and said she was going to rest for a while, and she didn't get up from it for the better part of a week." He paused. "Proud women built this West, Miss Dalton. I don't know who decided that was something to be criticized." The words settled on her like the evening air, slow and warm. She did not say anything for a moment, because she was occupied with the unexpected sensation of having something she had been carrying a very long time partially lifted from her shoulders. "Your mother sounds like someone I would have liked," she said. "She would have liked you," he said simply. "She liked people who knew their own minds." She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and the evening light was doing something particularly unfair to the angles of his face, and Virginia Dalton, who had not been at a loss for composure in several years at minimum, felt something shift inside her that she recognized, distantly and with a combination of interest and alarm, as the beginning of a significant change. She climbed down from the fence and said good night in what she hoped was a normal voice, and walked back toward the house, and spent the better part of the next 2 hours telling herself a variety of sensible things that did not seem to be taking hold. Through the first weeks of July, the heat came down on Calhoun County like a lid pressed onto a pot, and the work of the ranch did not stop for it. Virginia and her hands were up before dawn every day, moving cattle to the shaded areas of the pastures during the worst of the afternoon heat, making sure the stock tanks were clean and full, keeping an eye on the grass for the early brown that meant a pasture needed to rest. She and Ira fell into a pattern that felt entirely natural, and that she was careful not to examine too closely, riding the property together in the mornings to check conditions, discussing what needed doing over coffee before the heat became implacable, talking in the evenings sometimes when the day's work was done. They talked about cattle and land and water rights and the price of beef at the fall auctions in Victoria, and they also talked about other things, things that had nothing directly to do with the operation of the Dalton ranch. He told her about his years working ranches in the Hill Country and the Nueces Country, and a brief period up along the Canadian River near the Texas Panhandle. And she told him about growing up on this land, learning it from her father, learning to read weather and soil, and the behavior of cattle in the particular way that comes from a childhood spent paying attention. They talked about books, which surprised them both. He read whatever he could get his hands on, which in his roving life had been an eclectic collection, and she had been educated seriously by a father who believed ignorance was a waste of capacity. He had not yet said anything that could be clearly interpreted as personal feeling, and she had not said anything either. There was a quality to the thing between them that was like a conversation that both people know is building toward something important, but that neither has yet found the exact words to begin. The exact words, when they came from somewhere outside both of them first. It was a Saturday in mid-July, and Virginia had driven the buckboard into Harlow for supplies. She was at the dry goods counter speaking with Frank Morrow, who ran the store, when she became aware that two women at the fabric table nearby had been conducting a conversation in the kind of deliberately audible undertone that is meant to be overheard. She had been ignoring it in the principled way she usually ignored this kind of thing, but then she caught her own name and paused. Virginia Dalton, the first woman, she could now see it was Mrs. Annette Foss, the surveyor's wife, was saying, will end up alone on that ranch because she simply does not know how to be agreeable. It is not that she is unintelligent. It is that she is too proud to let a man feel that he is needed. My Herbert said the same, said the second woman, who was Mrs. Pearl Drucker. He says there is not a man in the county who would want to take on a woman who thinks she knows better than everyone else. She does know better than most of them, said Mrs. Foss, which was apparently meant as a criticism but had the opposite effect on the air in the room. That is not the point, said Mrs. Drucker firmly. Virginia set down the bolt of fabric she had been examining and said, in her normal conversational voice, "That's very kind of you both to concern yourselves with my situation." She watched them turn, red-faced. "I'll save you the worry. I am perfectly at home with my own company, and I believe that being alone on honest terms is considerably better than the alternative." She finished her transaction with Frank Morrow, who was examining his counter with intense focus, loaded her supplies into the buckboard, and drove back toward the ranch with a straight spine and a level expression that she maintained all the way until the town was behind her, and there was nothing but open country ahead. At which point she let out a breath that was partly frustration and partly something else that she was not quite ready to name. She pulled the buckboard into the yard to find Ira at the water pump, washing dust off his hands and forearms, and something about the ordinary sight of him there in the late afternoon light made the morning's irritation recede faster than she would have expected. "Town was full of opinions today," she said, unloading the buckboard. He came over and took the heavier boxes without being asked. "About anything particular?" "About me," she said. "The usual category." He set the boxes on the porch and looked at her steadily. "You want to tell me what they said?" she considered. "They said I was too proud, that no man would want to take me on, variations on a theme I have heard before." His jaw moved in a way that suggested thoughts being carefully organized. "Is that so?" he said. "It is the standard view of my character in Harlow," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think people who have never had to be strong for themselves sometimes mistake strength for pride, and I think there are worse things to be accused of than knowing who you are." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and it was July in Texas, and the air between them was the temperature of a low fire. "Ira," she said, because his name felt like the right beginning. "Virginia," he said, and the way he said it, not Miss Dalton, not the formal address she heard from everyone else, but her name, plain and careful and full of something, made her heart do a thing she had not expected her heart to do. They were both quiet for a moment in which several things became clear without being stated. "I am not an easy person," she said finally. "I have been told this with great consistency." "I don't want an easy person," he said. "I want a real one." She looked at him for a long time. The sun was going down behind the mesquite line, and the yard was full of warm shadow, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the world was being very still in the way it sometimes is when something important is in the process of happening. "I think you should know," she said, "that I am not the kind of woman who changes herself to fit a circumstance." "I think you should know," he said, "that I would not ask that of you." She picked up the remaining supply box from the buckboard, not because it was urgent, but because she needed something to do with her hands, and carried it inside, and Ira held the door for her, and that was the evening. But it was a different kind of evening than before. Something had been spoken without being fully said, and it lay between them now not as an obstacle but as a beginning, warm and present and real. It was Jeremiah Colt who, with the inadvertent timing of a villain in a melodrama, provided the next development. He arrived in mid-August with a different kind of visit this time. He came alone, which was unusual, and he dismounted in the yard, which was also unusual, and he took off his hat. Virginia watched this from the porch with the wariness of a woman who has learned to be attentive to departures from pattern. "Miss Dalton," he said. He was a big man, Colt, wide through the shoulders, with a thick gray-streaked mustache and the confident tan of a man who spent a great deal of time outdoors deciding things. "I've come to make a plain offer." "You've made plain offers before," she said. "This one is different," he said. "I'm proposing a partnership arrangement on the water rights. Your deeded rights on the creek section in exchange for grazing access to the east section of my upper pasture, which, as you know, has better grass than yours in a dry year." She looked at him. It was, she had to admit, a more sophisticated offer than his previous ones. It had the structure of something a reasonable person might actually consider. "Put it in writing," she said. "Bring it to me in writing with the specific language of what you mean by partnership arrangement, and I will look at it." He nodded, replaced his hat, remounted, and rode away. Virginia stood on the porch for a moment after he had gone, turning the offer over in her mind, looking at it from multiple angles. Ira came up from the direction of the barn. "Colt," he said. "Yes," she said. "He made an offer on the water rights, a trade arrangement. Do you trust it?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's why I told him to put it in writing. If the language is what he says the language is, it might be reasonable. If it isn't, the language will show it." "You want someone to look it over with you when it comes?" he asked. She glanced at him. "Can you read a legal document?" "Well enough," he said. "I've had occasion to." "Then yes," she said. "I would appreciate that." The document came 3 days later, delivered by Colt's lawyer, a thin man named Pryor who was precisely as trustworthy as his employer required him to be. Virginia read it that evening at her desk with the lamp turned up high, and Ira sat across from her with his own copy, and they went through it section by section, with the focused attention of two people who understand that the devil lives in specific language. It took nearly 2 hours, in which Ira identified 2 clauses that were problematic, one that defined the partnership arrangement in a way that could be interpreted to give Colt's heirs a claim on the creek property in the event of Virginia's death without immediate descendants, and one that defined dry year in a way that would conveniently classify most average years as dry years, and therefore give Colt grazing access on a more or less permanent basis. "There," Virginia said when she saw it, "the second clause. That's the actual offer. The rest of it is packaging." "If you want to make a counter," Ira said, "I'd strike both those clauses and redefine the grazing access in terms of specific acreage rather than a vague arrangement." She looked at him across the desk, across the lamp and the papers. "Where did you learn to read a document like this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, as if deciding something. "My father, before he broke his back, was a justice of the peace in Calhoun County," he said. "I helped him in his office from the time I was old enough to read. I learned to think about what language meant before I learned algebra." It was the most he had told her about his past in a single moment, and it opened something. They sat at her father's desk in her father's house, while the August night pressed warm against the windows, and they talked not about the document, but about the larger things, about what it meant to come from something, to be shaped by a place and a family, and then to carry that into a different life in different country. He told her about his father's recovery, slow and partial, and about the years of watching his mother hold things together, and she told him about the summer her father had been sick, a different illness, a recoverable one, and she had run the ranch alone for the first time at 15 and discovered that she could. "That's when you knew," he said. "That's when I knew," she agreed. By the time they had talked the better part of the document and the better part of the night into the past, the lamp had burned low and the air through the window had gone from warm to merely pleasant, and Virginia looked across the desk at Ira Morgan and felt with great clarity that she was in significant trouble of the best possible kind. She rewrote the offer clauses. She sent it back to Colt. He accepted the revised terms after 3 days of silence, and the water rights arrangement was signed and registered at the land office in the second week of September. Carl Weston shook her hand when she filed it and said her father would have been proud, and she thanked him and drove home with a steadiness in her chest that felt like settled ground. The fall came on the way it does in southern Texas, not the dramatic leaf-turning of more northern places, but a gradual easing of the heat, a sharpening of the morning air, a new color in the light. The cattle auction in Victoria was in October, and Virginia spent the first part of September preparing her herd for market, selecting the cattle for sale, documenting them, making the practical calculations that determined the ranch's financial position for another year. She and Ira rode the herd together in the early mornings, and on a morning in the last week of September, when the sky was the clear deep blue of autumn and the grass was dry gold and perfectly still, he pulled his horse up alongside hers at the top of the low rise that gave a view of the whole south pasture, and he said without particular preamble, "I need to say something to you." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the pasture below them and then looking at her. "I came to this ranch as a hired hand," he said. "And I have tried to be a good hired hand and to not overstep, because I respect you and I respect what you've built here, and I know that you don't need anything from anyone that you haven't asked for. But there is a thing I've been carrying for several months that is getting heavier, and I think continuing to not say it is a kind of dishonesty that I'm no longer comfortable with." She looked at him. Her heart was entirely calm, which surprised her, because she would have expected it to do something more dramatic at this moment. "Then say it," she said. "I love you," he said, with the same plain directness he had applied to everything since the first morning he rode into her yard. "I have been in love with you for most of the summer. I am in love with the way you think and the way you work, and the way you stand your ground without making a performance of it, and the way you talked about your father's land that first evening on the fence, and the way you read a legal document with the same attention you give to a sick calf. I am in love with you completely, and I am aware that you have every reason in the world to tell me that this is not a thing you want, and if that's what you tell me, I will respect it without reservation. But I could not continue not saying it." He stopped. The morning was very quiet around them. Virginia Dalton looked at the man beside her on horseback in the autumn light of the Texas hill country, this man who had ridden into her yard 4 months ago and asked for work, and told her the truth about card games, and answered every question directly, and identified the problematic clauses in a legal document, and told her that proud women built this West as if it were an obvious truth that anyone ought to know, and she felt something complete and certain move through her from somewhere deep. "Ira Morgan," she said, and her voice was steady but warm in a way she did not try to control. "I have been telling myself sensible things about you since approximately the third week of April, and not a single one of them has managed to change the fact that I think about you with great frequency and warmth, and that the ranch feels different when you're in it, not because you are useful, though you are useful, but because you are you. And I am not in the habit of saying things I don't mean." He looked at her, and something happened in his eyes that she thought she might want to see for the rest of her life. "Does that mean what I think it means?" he asked. "It means I love you too," she said, which was the most direct thing she had ever said in her life and felt exactly right for that reason. "It means that I am not unaware of the complications that come with loving someone who works for me on the ranch I intend to keep running. The complications are worth addressing," he said. "I have some thoughts about that." "So do I," she said. "But perhaps we start with the herd check and address the rest of it this evening." He smiled, that full smile that did the inconvenient thing to the air, and they rode down the rise into the south pasture together. That evening, on the porch of the ranch house with the stars coming out over the Texas dark and the September air doing its best to be cool, they talked plainly and at length about what they both wanted. Virginia had thought about this conversation for weeks without knowing when it would happen, and she had certain positions that she wanted to be clear from the beginning. She was not going to give up running the ranch. She was not going to hand decision-making to anyone. She was not going to become a different person, because the state of Texas generally expected married women to compress themselves into smaller versions of who they had been. Ira, sitting beside her in the second porch chair with his coffee, listened to all of this with attention. "I agree to all of that," he said. She looked at him. "That was fast." "I've had some time to think about it too," he said. "Virginia, I did not fall in love with the idea of a manageable woman. I fell in love with you. The specific version of you that runs this ranch the way it should be run and tells county sheriffs about the Texas statutes and rewrites legal clauses and sits on the fence watching cattle in the evening light. If you became someone else, I would not be in the same situation I am currently in. So my agreement is not a concession. It is a preference." She looked at the stars for a moment. Then she said, "I think I need a little time, not a long time, but I want to be sure of myself." "Take what you need," he said without hesitation. She took 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks she continued everything exactly as it had been: the work, the conversations, the daily rhythms of the ranch, with the difference that she was also paying close attention to what she felt and thinking about what she wanted with the same systematic rigor she applied to the ranch accounts. She examined the question of Ira Morgan from every angle she could conceive of. She thought about her father and what he would have said, and she thought she knew. Edmund Dalton had spent his entire life trying to find people whose words and actions matched, and she believed that Ira's did. She thought about the practical reality of a man who had no property of his own, and she thought that this was not an obstacle but a starting point, and that the Dalton ranch was large enough for 2 people to build on, and that 2 capable people working toward the same end could accomplish considerably more than one person alone, which was not a weakness to admit but a mathematical fact. She thought about the county's opinion and found, to her genuine satisfaction, that it had essentially no weight in her decision. Not 0 weight. She was human and had lived in Calhoun County for 26 years and could not pretend the community meant nothing to her. But it was not a weight that was going to change her mind. On the evening of the 22nd day, she walked out to the barn where Ira was finishing the evening chores, and she said, "I've thought about it." He put down what he was holding. "And I would like to continue what we've started," she said, "and I would like to know what you intend by it." He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket, which she had not expected, and took out a ring, a modest thing, a small gold band set with a dark red stone, and held it in his palm. "I have been carrying this for 2 weeks," he said, with a slight expression that was not quite embarrassment but was close to it. "I bought it in Harlow the 2nd day after we had our conversation on the porch. I did not want to produce it at the wrong moment." She looked at the ring in his palm and felt something that was warm and steady and certain. "Ask me properly," she said. He took a breath. "Virginia Dalton, I know you are capable of everything that needs doing without any help from me. I know you run this ranch better than most men in the county run theirs. I know the whole county thinks you are too proud to accept anything from anyone, and I think they have it backwards. I think you are too honest to accept anything that isn't genuinely worth accepting. And I am asking you, with full knowledge of who you are, and with no intention of asking you to be anything other than exactly that, if you will marry me." The barn was quiet. Outside, the Texas evening was doing its slow, enormous work. "Yes," she said, which was the plainest and most important word she had spoken in her entire life. He put the ring on her finger, and then she was in his arms, which was the first time that had happened, and it was the most natural thing, as if she had been moving in that direction for the entire spring and summer and fall without knowing it. His arms around her were solid and warm and real, and she pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment, and allowed herself the unfamiliar luxury of leaning just slightly into something other than herself. Then she stood straight and looked at him. "We should tell the hands in the morning," she said. He laughed a full, unguarded laugh, and she felt it like something bright. "Yes," he said, "we probably should." The wedding was in November, on a clear Saturday when the air had the crisp, clean quality that Texas air occasionally achieves in late fall, as if apologizing for the summer. Virginia wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool with cream-colored trim, and she wore her hair down in a way she almost never did. And Ira wore a coat she had not seen before that he must have had cleaned in Harlow, and they stood in front of the Methodist minister in the small church on Calhoun Street with Hector and Tobias as witnesses, and a collection of other townsfolk who had come because word had gotten out. Mrs. Annette Foss was in the third pew. Virginia saw her and felt no particular ill will toward her. People were shaped by their times and their limited exposure to different possibilities, and that was its own kind of poverty. She hoped Mrs. Foss might, over time, expand her understanding of what a woman's life could look like. The minister, a straightforward man named Reverend Doss who was not given to theatrics, asked the questions and they answered them. When it came to the part where the minister traditionally asked who gives this woman, the question was addressed to an empty pew because Virginia had no living family, and she said quietly but clearly, "I give myself," which I think is the more accurate arrangement anyway. And Reverend Doss looked at her for a half-second and then said, "Indeed," and continued the ceremony. Ira, beside her, was trying very hard not to smile. The reception was held at the Masonic Hall because it was the largest available space, and Mrs. Clara Beecham, the banker's wife, she of the Ship Without a Rudder Council, came and shook Virginia's hand and said, in a quiet voice that contained the specific quality of a person revising their opinion without wanting to make a production of it, that she wished her well. Virginia thanked her and meant it. The dance lasted until 10 o'clock, and there was punch and cake, and the fiddler from over in Yoakum who played fast reels and slow waltzes with equal commitment. Virginia and Ira danced twice, which was not many but was enough, and the second dance was slow, and she danced with her head slightly against his jaw, and thought about the fact that she had not expected to arrive at this particular point in her life in anything resembling this way, and that this was the best possible argument for the unknowability of the future. Jean Purcell, who had been the one to send Ira to her ranch in the first place, shook Ira's hand at the end of the evening with the satisfied expression of a man whose recommendation had worked out considerably better than he had any right to expect. "You tell him you were the one who sent me," Ira said to Virginia later that night with something like amusement. "I gave him a moment of satisfaction," she said. "He's a decent old man. He's earned it." Their first winter together as a married couple on the Dalton ranch was, in the way of things, not dramatically different from the autumn that had preceded it. The work was the same work. The land was the same land. What was different was the morning coffee and the evening fire and the presence of another person in the house, Not a constraining presence, but an expanding one. The way a house actually becomes more itself when it has people in it who fit it. Ira had not, as he had promised, changed the essential nature of how the ranch ran. What he had done was bring additional capacity to it. His particular skills, his additional physical labor, his way of thinking about cattle and land that complemented hers rather than superseding it. They disagreed on things with some regularity, and when they disagreed, they argued with the specific vigor of two people who both think clearly and neither of whom yields without a reason, and in most cases they arrived somewhere better than either of them had started. In the cases where they didn't, one of them deferred and the other took note of the debt. It was a good winter. The county found this somewhat difficult to categorize, which gave Virginia a private satisfaction she kept mostly to herself. The Colt situation, which had been resolved on paper in September, settled gradually into something that looked almost like a functional neighboring relationship. Colt was not a converted man. He still ran his operations with the imperial confidence of someone who believed most things should eventually be his. But the water rights agreement held, and the incidents that had characterized the previous year did not recur. Virginia suspected he had recalculated and decided that she and the Dalton ranch were more trouble to fight than they were worth in terms of the energy required, which was not friendship but was functional, and functional was enough. Spring came again, and with it, the kind of news that changes the shape of a house and a life. Virginia knew before she told Ira, which was the nature of things, and she chose to tell him on a morning in early March when the bluebonnets were just starting along the south fence line, because it seemed fitting. She told him plainly, without preamble, because that was how she told things, and watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that included disbelief, comprehension, a moment of pure and uncomplicated joy so direct that it moved her, and then something quieter and deeper that she recognized as the same thing she felt. He came around the fence they had been inspecting and took her hands and said, "Are you well? Is everything well?" "Everything is well," she said. "I am healthy and the doctor in Harlow confirms it, and I have every intention of continuing to run this ranch until approximately a week before I'm no longer able to, at which point I will rest briefly and then resume." He laughed and pulled her clothes, and she let herself be held, which she was getting better at. "I am so happy," he said, into her hair. "So am I," she said, which was true. The summer of 1883 passed with a particular quality of fullness that Virginia would remember for the rest of her life. She worked the ranch through the hottest months because she was well and capable, and saw no reason to treat herself as fragile, though she accepted Ira's quiet management of the heaviest lifting without fighting it more than twice, which she thought showed considerable personal growth. Hector, who had been on the ranch nearly 2 years now and had the contained warmth of a grandfather who would never say anything sentimental directly, appeared one morning with a rocking chair that he had built himself from ash wood and sat on the porch with the explanation that it was for sitting, not for anything else, and refused to discuss it further. Tobias, the young hand who had grown considerably in competence and confidence over the previous year, made himself useful in every possible direction and developed a habit of appearing with useful things: coffee, a repaired item, a relevant piece of information, at the exact moment they were needed, which Virginia thought showed the makings of an excellent ranch foreman. In September, Ira rode to Victoria for the cattle auction with the two hands while Virginia stayed at the ranch at the doctor's firm instruction, being now in the final weeks of her pregnancy. She managed the property alone for 3 days without incident, and then Ira was back with the auction prices, which were good, and with a look on his face every time he looked at her that she had come to recognize as the expression of a man taking continuous inventory of something precious. The boy was born on the 4th of October, 1883, which was a day of high white clouds and cool, pleasant air, as if the world had arranged itself to be welcoming. The midwife, a steady woman named Mrs. Cardenas, who had delivered more babies in Calhoun County than anyone alive, presided with calm competence. Ira sat in the hallway outside the bedroom for the entirety of the labor, which was several hours, and Virginia could hear him occasionally standing up and sitting down, as if the effort of staying still was taxing his entire system. When Mrs. Cardenas opened the door and told him he could come in, he came in with the expression of a man who has been through something significant without being technically present for it. And then he saw Virginia holding the baby, and the expression became something else entirely, simple and enormous and completely unguarded. "He's fine," Virginia said. "He's perfectly fine." Ira sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was red-faced and indignant about the general situation in the way of all newborns. "What do you want to name him?" Ira asked. She had been thinking about this. "Edmund," she said. "For my father." He looked at her. "Edmund Morgan," he said, and the words settled into the air of the room like something permanent. "Edmund Morgan," she agreed. Edmund Morgan was a healthy and opinionated child from the very beginning, which did not surprise either of his parents. He had Virginia's eyes and Ira's coloring, and a disposition that combined the best and most formidable aspects of both. He slept when he decided to sleep and woke when he decided to wake, and regarded the world around him with the attentive brown eyes of someone who was making assessments. Hector held him once, the day after his birth, with the particular careful dignity of a man who had not held a baby in 20 years but remembered how, and said, "He looks like someone who knows things," which everyone agreed was an accurate early observation. The winter of 1883 was mild, and 1884 came in clear and full of promise. Virginia was back at full operation of the ranch by December, which was 6 weeks after Edmund's birth and slightly sooner than Mrs. Cardenas had recommended. But Mrs. Cardenas had worked with Virginia long enough to have calibrated her recommendations to the realistic rather than the ideal. The ranch ran well. Edmund grew. Ira had formally become a partner in the ranch operation by the end of 1883. Virginia had drawn up the arrangement herself, with the same care she had given the Colt document, and it was registered at the county land office, so there was no ambiguity about what belonged to whom and what they owned together. She had told him what she was doing before she did it, plainly, sitting at the desk the way they had sat over the Colt document, and said, "This ranch is what my father left me, and it is mine, and the way I want it to be mine with you is as partners, not as one person and their spouse. Is that how you want it?" "That is exactly how I want it," he said. "Then let's draw it up right," she said. It was in the spring of 1884, when Edmund was 6 months old, and Virginia was carrying him on her hip during the morning fence check while Ira walked alongside them, that they encountered the first real test of the thing they had built together. Not from outside, not from Colt or the county's opinions, but from a question of direction that required them to think as a unit. A rancher from over in Refugio County, a man named Samuel Birch, who was well regarded and honest, had approached them about leasing 200 acres of Dalton grassland that sat on the far northeast corner of the property and was currently underused. The lease terms were generous. The practical effect would be additional income and reduced pressure on their own herd during droughts. Ira thought it was a good idea. Virginia had reservations. They talked about it for 3 evenings, not arguing exactly, but pressing each other's thinking, identifying the assumptions underneath each position. Virginia's reservation was not the financial terms, but the principle of letting someone else's cattle onto Dalton land, which felt in some way like a dilution of something that mattered to her beyond the practical. Ira listened to this carefully and then said, quietly, "Is it about Colt? About the precedent of any arrangement that involves someone else's interest in this land?" She thought about that. "Maybe," she said, "because Birch is not Colt," he said. "A properly drawn lease with clear termination provisions doesn't give anyone a claim, it gives you income and gives the land rest." "I know that legally," she said, but she was quiet for a moment. "My father spent his life making sure no one else had a stake in this land," she said. "I think I carry that very deeply." "That's a good instinct," Ira said. "But your father was protecting himself from cult-type arrangements. Birch isn't that." She sat with this for a while. Then she said, "Draft the lease terms. I want to review the termination provisions specifically." He drafted them. She reviewed them. They were exactly what he had described, clean and clear and protective of her interests. She signed them. The Northeast pasture lease to Samuel Birch for 3 seasons was one of the better financial decisions they made in those years, and Virginia, being honest, told Ira so. "You were right," she said, when the first lease payment came in the fall of 1884. "We were right," he said. "You made sure the terms were solid." She looked at him across the table where they were reviewing the accounts together, and thought about the word "we," and how it had taken her so long to believe it could apply to her without diminishing something, and how entirely wrong she had been about that. The years moved as years do on a working ranch, not slowly, but with the texture of days that each contained something real. Edmund grew from infancy into a small person who walked, and then ran and had strong opinions about horses. He wanted to be near them from the time he could express a preference, and who showed early signs of having his mother's precision with language and his father's patience with difficult things. Virginia taught him the land the way her father had taught her, taking him out in the mornings on her saddle from the time he was old enough to sit securely, naming things and explaining things and letting him ask the questions that children ask, which are often the sharpest questions. Ira was present in the way that Virginia valued above most things, not hovering, not performing parenthood, but genuinely there, reading Edmund the books they had, teaching him the names of tools and the reasons behind the way things were done, sitting with him in the evenings with the particular patience that had first showed itself with a difficult mare named Clover years before. In 1886, their daughter was born in May, into weather so warm and sweetly scented that it seemed designed as a welcome. They named her Clara, not after Mrs. Beecham, which might have been a statement of irony that not everyone would appreciate, but after Ira's mother, whose name was Clara Morgan and who had run the ferry crossing in the hill country, and who Virginia felt deserved to have something good named for her. Edmund, at 2.5, observed his new sister with the careful wariness of a child who has not yet decided how he feels about a fundamental change to the existing arrangement, and then decided within a week that she was acceptable. He brought her things, small objects, interesting rocks, a sprig of bluebonnet, and presented them with the gravity of a person offering significant gifts, which Virginia thought was the beginning of a good character. The ranch that Edmund Dalton had built from a mule and a used saddle had grown, in the years since Virginia had taken it over, from 420 acres to nearly 600, the additional acres having been purchased from a neighboring family that had decided to move further west. The herd was larger. The operation was solid and paid its way, and then some. Hector Baines had stayed all these years and had graduated from hired hand to something that functioned more like an institution. He knew every acre of the place and every animal on it, and his quiet competence was as much a part of the ranch as the fence posts. Tobias had become the foreman Virginia had seen in him early, managing the day-to-day operations with the easy authority of a man who had grown fully into his work. On an evening in the summer of 1887, Virginia sat on the porch of the ranch house, on the ashwood rocking chair that Hector had built years ago, which had now been repaired twice, and was still in daily use, with Clara asleep against her shoulder and Edmund in the yard chasing fireflies with the focused commitment of a 4-year-old with a purpose. The evening air was doing what Texas evening air sometimes does, which is briefly perfect, and the light was the specific gold of late summer, and Ira came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside her. "How's the south herd looking?" she asked. "Good," he said. That new bull is doing what we paid him to do. I think the next fall auction is going to be a strong one." "Good," she said. She shifted Clara slightly and took her coffee with her free hand. They sat for a while watching Edmund in the yard. The fireflies were thick tonight, moving through the heavy sweet air like small lanterns. "Do you remember," Virginia said, "what Mrs. Foss said at the dry goods store about how no man would want to take me on?" "I remember you telling me about it," he said. "I thought about that a great deal at the time," she said. "I thought about it more than I admitted, because it touched the thing I actually was afraid of, which was not being alone. I was fine with being alone, but being seen in a way that was fundamentally wrong. Seen as merely proud, as merely stubborn, and not as someone who had actual reasons for being the way she was." He was quiet, listening. "And what I have come to understand," she said, "over the last 5 years, is that being seen correctly, actually, honestly seen by even one person changes the arithmetic considerably." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the fireflies moved through the air between the porch and the mesquite, and Edmund caught one in his cupped hands and held it up to look at the light. "Look," Edmund said from the yard. "I see it," Ira called back. "Don't hold it too long." Edmund opened his hands and the firefly went up into the dark, blinking. Virginia leaned her head briefly against Ira's shoulder and Clara slept on, and the Texas evening went on being what it was, which was large and dark and full of stars and completely, entirely enough. In the years that followed, the Dalton Morgan Ranch, as it had come to be called by the practical acknowledgement of the operation's joint ownership, continued to build and grow and weather the things that the years brought to it. There were dry summers and good summers. There were seasons of tight money and seasons of plenty. There were the usual troubles of a working ranch, stock losses and fence damage, and the occasional negotiation with neighbors that required both firmness and goodwill. And there were the unusual troubles that the West still carried in 1887 and into the following years, though the frontier was settling, and the wildness that had defined the earlier decades was giving way, slowly and not always smoothly, to something more organized. Virginia watched this change with an attention that was not exactly nostalgia, but was something adjacent to it. She had been born into the wild years, formed by them, and she understood that the very things that had made her life possible, the space, the openness, the degree to which a woman with sufficient determination could carve out a life outside the usual limits, were partly the products of conditions that were becoming less extreme. She was glad for the settling. She was also aware of what was being lost, and she thought it was honest to hold both of those things at once. She thought about the people who had been in this country before the ranchers and the fences and the county land offices, and she thought about what the settling meant to them, and she thought that the justice ledger of the West had a great deal in it that would never be fully balanced, and that this deserved to be remembered even when it was uncomfortable. Edmund was old enough by 1890 to ride fence with his father in the mornings, and he did so with the serious purpose of a boy who has understood from early on that the ranch is not a backdrop to his life, but the actual substance of it. He asked questions that required real answers, which Ira gave him, and he asked questions that required thinking through rather than answering, which Virginia gave him, and he was growing into something that both of them looked at with the particular satisfaction of people who have helped make something they are genuinely proud of. Clara was 4 and had inherited, with what Virginia considered to be the universe's sense of humor, a combination of her mother's directness and her father's calm, which produced a child who was simultaneously the most reasonable and most immovable small person Virginia had ever encountered. She told Clara that one day this would serve her extremely well. Clara accepted this information without apparent surprise. In the autumn of 1890, they hired 2 additional hands to manage the expanded herd, and the bunkhouse that had once held 4 bunks was extended to hold 6, which Hector supervised with the authority of a man who had been doing things on this property long enough that his opinions about how they should be done were essentially law. He had turned 63 that year and showed no sign of slowing down, though Virginia had quietly told him that when he decided he was ready to stop, there was a small house on the north edge of the property that was his for as long as he wanted it. He had looked at her for a moment and said, "Your father was a good man, Miss Virginia," which was the most personal thing he had said to her in 10 years, and she had felt it accordingly. On the occasion of their 8th wedding anniversary in November of 1890, Ira gave Virginia a new ledger, a good one, leather-bound, with her name and the ranch's name tooled on the cover, because he had noticed that her current ledger was worn through at the spine. It was entirely practical and entirely correct, and she received it with the expression of a woman who has been known accurately and considers this the finest of all gifts. She gave him a copy of a book she had tracked down through a bookstore in San Antonio, a natural history of the Texas Hill Country written by a man who had spent 30 years observing the land, which she had corresponded about in 3 letters over the course of 4 months to obtain. He looked at it for a long time, turning the pages, and then looked at her. 4 months, he said. Approximately, she said. He set the book down carefully, stood up, and kissed her with the warmth and the settled certainty of a man who has been in love with the same woman for 8 years and finds the situation entirely adequate. The ranch went on into the new decade carrying everything that had been built in it, the land and the cattle and the people, and the years of work and argument and love, and shared purpose, and Virginia, Dalton Morgan, whose pride the county had once considered a defect, ran it with her husband beside her and her children growing into themselves around her, and she considered the whole business of her life, the long, beautiful, difficult, particular business of it, with the same attention she had always given to everything that mattered. She was, as the county had always noted, proud. She was also correct, which the county was beginning to understand, slowly, and in the gradual way of large institutions revising their positions, was not the same thing and never had been. The South Creek ran clear and full with the autumn rains of 1890, and flowed across the deeded water rights that were hers by law and had been maintained by her own careful attention, and the cattle drank from it in the long gold afternoon, and Ira rode up beside her at the south fence where she had pulled her horse to look at the scene below. And he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and they sat there together in the particular silence of 2 people who have built something real and know it. While the light moved west and the evening star appeared over the far edge of the Dalton land, burning steady and clear above everything they had made. Edmund found them there a few minutes later, riding up from the east pasture with the easy competence of a boy who has been on horseback his whole life, and he pulled up beside his father and looked at the creek and the cattle and the evening sky with the expression of a child who is seeing something familiar and finding it newly extraordinary. "It's nice," he said, in the direct way of someone who has inherited both his parents' habits of understatement. "It is," Virginia said. They rode home together as the dark came down, the 3 of them, and the ranch lights came on in the house and the bunkhouse and the barn, warm squares of yellow in the enormous Texas dark, and the sound of Clara calling from the porch reached them before they could see her, which was nothing unusual and everything wonderful. Virginia unsaddled her horse in the barn with practiced ease and led her to the stall, and in the quiet of the barn with the smell of hay and leather and horses around her, she stood for a moment in the stillness and felt the whole shape of her life as a complete thing, not finished, not closed, but whole in the way that things are whole when they have been built honestly and maintained with care and shared with the right person. She had been too proud, they said. She had been exactly herself, was the truth of it, and the West had not broken her for it, and neither had the county and neither had the years. She had taken this land and this life and this love and made of them something lasting and true, and the rocking chair on the porch and the ledger with her name on the cover, and the children's voices in the house, and the man she had chosen and who had chosen her, were all evidence of a single plain fact that she had understood since she was 15 years old and running this ranch alone for the first time, that knowing who you are is not a liability. It is the only foundation anything worth having can be built on. She put out the barn lamp and walked toward the house, where the light was on and the door was open, and Ira was standing in the doorway watching her come across the yard. And she walked toward him through the Texas dark with her whole life behind her and before her, and he held out his hand, and she took it.